been asked along tonight to speak not as a board member of the ASRC, but to share with you my family's story and the journey that brought us here from Vietnam as asylum seekers to Australia in the late 1970s. It's a very personal story for me and my family, so I'll do my best to keep it all together. So wish me luck. The north and the south of Vietnam had been at war for 20 years before I was born. The Americans and Australians supported the South Vietnamese in this war against the communist Viet Cong forces in the north. My mum and dad, Van and To, grew up together on the same street in a little neighbourhood in the city of Saigon, now what's known as Ho Chi Minh City. They went to school together, they fell in love, and they got married in 1966. Despite the ongoing war, they had a good life and were well off by local standards. At the time, my father was conscripted into the South Vietnamese army and worked on the US Air Base in Saigon for the Americans. Due to the unpopularity of the war at the time, the US government decided to pull out and ordered the last-minute evacuation of Saigon on the 29th of April 1975. My dad talks about the hysterical crowds at the time with all the Vietnamese people surrounding US compounds, all desperately trying to get out. There was panic and chaos everywhere as word got around that the Americans were leaving and Saigon would fall. After the last helicopter flew out, there was nothing left for the people of Saigon to do but to wait in fear for the North Vietnamese and Communist Viet Cong to arrive. When the army arrived in the city, soldiers went around rounding up people for execution. They went around at night to take people from their homes, some for execution and torture. Others were taken away to mass labour camps, or what was known at the time as re-education camps. My father was taken away to one of those camps. He was accused of being a traitor to his country for working for the Americans and was made to repent all his wrongdoings. Fortunately, my father survived his ordeal, but my parents lived in fear for their own lives and the lives of their 5 young children. They felt that there was no choice but to flee Vietnam. My family made several failed attempts to escape on unseaworthy fishing boats, and it cost my parents all that they owned. They did not have enough money to attempt another escape without leaving someone behind. My father volunteered to stay behind, but my mother refused to separate the family. So she went to beg a relative to lend us the money so that we can make one final attempt to flee as a family. Fortunately for us, she was successful. We paid for our passage yet again and boarded a 20-metre fishing boat in the dead of night, along with other passengers with nothing more than the clothes on our backs. The plan was to try and reach the neighbouring country, Malaysia. Our family huddled in the bows of the overcrowded boat, mothers hushing their crying children, people were being sick, the atmosphere was thick with fear. Not long after setting off into the open seas, we were spotted and pursued by Thai pirates. They'd come to learn that there was a flood of human misery to prey upon. We'd heard of all the horrific things that the pirates would do to the passengers of the boats. This was yet another fear that the people had to live with. Again, we were the lucky ones. We managed to lose the pirates and sight at land on the 5th day of our journey. We'd arrived on the coast of Malaysia. However, this was not the end of our troubles. The Malaysian Coast Guard refused to allow our boat to land. They tried to turn us back by towing our now leaking boat out to open waters, refusing us entry to their country. In desperation, the captain of our fishing boat ploughed the vessel into the reefs surrounding the beaches of Guanton in Malaysia. All the passengers evacuated the boat and they came ashore. My parents couldn't swim. Getting off that boat, the water came up to their necks. My mum and dad held a child on either side, and whilst my eldest brother, who was 12 at the time, got to shore by himself. It was now late April in 1979, and my parents had just left behind their entire life, their home, and landed in a foreign place with 5 kids who were 12, 10, 7, 5 and 2 years old. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs and the knowledge that we were still alive and together. Conditions at the refugee camp were really tough in Malaysia. We were fenced off like animals and given little assistance. My parents recounted the first night at camp where it rained all night. All they had was a small plastic sheet that my mother had cleverly sewn into the back of my dad's jacket. They held that sheet over their 5 children the entire night to keep us dry as we slept on the sand. My father helped to bury many who died in the camp. Refugee camps are dangerous places. Conditions were squalid and Malaysian authorities dealt harshly with refugees. Luck was again on our side. After only a very short period of time, my family were accepted as refugees to Australia, thanks to the leadership of our former Prime Minister, the Honourable Mr. Malcolm Fraser. Mr. Fraser and his government saw the flood of refugees fleeing Southeast Asia at the time as a humanitarian crisis, rather than a political opportunity. And for this act of humanity, my family owe Mr. Fraser and this country an enormous debt of gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Fraser, for standing up and protecting my family. At the time, my parents had never heard of Australia and didn't know where it was, but it just didn't matter. We were so happy to be accepted anywhere, just to have the opportunity to feel safe. We arrived in Sydney, Australia, 6th of June 1979. We didn't know anyone, we didn't speak any English, and we had no money. But we had the most important thing of all, a chance at a new life. I often reflect about how difficult it would have been for my parents to adjust to a new language, a new culture, and the trauma of leaving family and friends behind in Vietnam. But I think their renewed sense of purpose and the hope of a possible future for their children was what drove them to keep going. They had one goal. It was to build a new life for themselves and their children in this new country who had taken a chance on them and taken them in at their most desperate moment. As a result, my family embraced all things Australian. We learnt to barbecue on the weekends, we played cricket, we watched Aussie rules, we even cursed like a fair dinkum Aussie, although I have to admit there was always a spring roll at the barbecue. My parents attended English classes in between working 3 factory jobs, 7 days a week to raise 5 kids. My family became Australian citizens on the 8th of July 1982. It was a very proud day for my mum and dad. Growing up, my parents would continually tell us how lucky we were and that we were not to waste this opportunity we were given. It was never open for discussion. We would all finish school and we'd all go to university and make something of ourselves. They also made it clear to us that they expected us to be doctors, dentists or lawyers, because these were good jobs. So of course we all dutifully went to university, but unfortunately for my parents, we had become more Australian than they'd bargained for. We opted for freedom of choice, and I work in finance now as an investment manager. My sister Wah became an architect, my eldest brother Ko became a pharmacist, my brother Kwan an accountant, and my brother Ku a chemical engineer. We've all got our own kids now, 9 Aussie grandchildren in total. So far the first grandchild is at university studying biomed, so maybe my parents will get their wish after all. It's been almost 36 years since we set off on that boat journey. Now, as a mother of 2 young children, I often reflect upon the desperation, the courage and love that drove my parents to seek asylum. I shudder to think that what would happen to our beautiful family if we were subject to the current circumstances that other asylum seekers face today. Before I wrap up, I'd just like to acknowledge all the staff and volunteers at the ASRC for their tireless work, and also my husband Peter, who is here with me tonight, who's been a wonderful supporter of the work I do with the ASRC. I often joke that my 2 children, Enya and Ethan, are descended from 2 lots of boat people. My husband's family have spent a considerable amount of time researching their ancestry, and what we discovered is that my husband and children are directly descended from Nathaniel Lucas and Thomas Lucas, who both came to Australia as part of the First Fleet in 1788. So I think that's quite poetic, don't you think? With the telling of my family's story, I truly hope it has shown you that there is another way, a more humane way, a way that will make this country of ours an even greater one. Thank you for listening to my story.